Hello, I'm Martin Christopher, and pleased to have this opportunity to share some ideas with you today. We're around this theme of managing the supply chain in a turbulent and uncertain world. And whilst it's become maybe a bit of a cliche to talk about uncertainty and turbulence today, the fact is this is a reality. Um, some have described this world that we live in as a VUCA world. V standing for volatility, meaning frequent but unexpected changes, things that take us by surprise often. And of course, that adds to uncertainty, the letter U, meaning that it becomes increasingly difficult to predict the future. Who knows what tomorrow is going to bring? And of course, at the same time, complexity significantly has increased um, in every aspect of business and indeed our own individual personal lives. The interdependencies, the interconnections, significantly greater than was the case in the past. And of course, ambiguous, meaning it's very difficult to know actually what's happening because the signals are difficult to read and to interpret. We're surrounded by so much data, but not necessarily an awful lot of information. And this VUCA world, I think, presents all manner of sort of challenges to the supply chain, particularly to those who wish to manage the supply chain. Because if you think about the world as it used to be, relatively predictable, stable to a large extent, and it was predictable. We could make forecasts. Okay, they weren't always accurate, but we could have a good stab at what do we reckon tomorrow is going to be like, and we can manufacture ahead of time. We could hold inventory. Today, the risk that's associated with that is significant, and really, what it's highlighting to me is we have to find new ways, both of designing the supply chain, but also of managing it. Just whilst we're talking about the sort of differences between the past and now. I mean, the supply chain as an idea really, well, I guess the word chain, sort of says it all. It was linear. It was often vertically integrated. We might own our upstream supply base or some of it, and our downstream distribution channels or some of them. Now we're very much part of what some have called an ecosystem. Multiple dependencies, many different players. We've outsourced so many things we used to do in-house. And so the level of connectivity, if you like, is a significantly higher level than was the case before. Again, if we're looking at the world as it used to be, if we're talking about product life cycles, we would expect a product, once we launched it into the marketplace, to be around for some time. We'd often be talking about years or even decades. Today, products come and go with a greater rapidity. Those life cycles are often measured in months, and hence the need for a much higher level of agility. The complexity of the products themselves, again, if we go back long enough to Henry Ford I, making just one product, the Model T Ford, and apparently used to say any color you like as long as it's black. Today, look at Ford or indeed any motor company. Massive range of products, so many different options, different models, of course, different accessories, literally tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands actually of possible combinations. And it's not just the case in the auto industry, you'll find this pretty well everywhere. Lead times too. In the past, the customer just got used to waiting. If things weren't in stock, you placed an order and you waited for it to arrive. Well, today, some people call it the Amazon effect. We all expect more, and particularly in terms of rapid response, next day delivery, even same day delivery today. Totally different world. And of course, demand, as we've already highlighted in the past, was relatively stable and hence predictable. Now it's volatile and difficult to forecast. And indeed, if we talk about forecasts, the accuracy, we never had brilliant accuracy. Even back in the 20th century. But given the sort of level of volatility that we experience today, it's not surprising that forecast accuracy has really just gone off the chart. And indeed, I think we might be questioning, in fact, I want to question whether we should be running the business on the basis of forecasts. I think we've got to become much better at responding to demand as it happens, being demand driven rather than forecast driven, if you want to put it that way. And indeed, I suppose this idea of moving from the sort of plan-based, forecast-based approach to something which is much more responsive to actual demand as it happens in the marketplace requires a much higher level of agility. You can't do this with traditional sort of structures and the sort of historical organization layouts that we've got to know for so long. Typically organizations in the past didn't have to move so quickly, and so this, I think, is really calling for a significant sort of well, I think as a revolution in the way in which we manage supply chains. Some people would argue, in fact, that we shouldn't be talking about a supply chain at all, because it's not a linear thing. It's not A to B to C. It's part of, obviously, a network. It's actually a complex system. If we think about what we can learn from studying ecosystems and so forth, one of the things that we have to sort of realize is that whilst in the past we've talked about designing an optimum supply chain, or people talk about network optimization, it suggests that there is a perfect solution to a particular set of requirements. Well, complex systems can't be optimized because they're constantly changing. And I think this is a sort of interesting angle here, and has many implications for modern supply chain management. What it's really saying is that we've got to constantly review the arrangements that we have in place, that what might have been optimum yesterday certainly isn't going to be optimum tomorrow. And so we're looking up for a much higher level of flexibility and adaptability. The system's going to have to constantly evolve. Our supply chains can't be set in concrete. And this, again, has got a lot of implications for how we actually structure a supply chain. If we've sort of invested heavily in bricks and mortar, we've got all sorts of long-term commitments and arrangements, we can't keep adapting and changing the shape of that supply chain. So this, I think, is a fundamental it's a fundamental contrast to the way in which we've always thought about supply chains. And this is a theme I want to go on to develop if I can. The other dimension too, I think, of modern supply chains is the fact that obviously with this VUCA sort of environment in which they exist, the level of risk is going to be significantly higher. Risk of disruptions. It could be, as we've seen in the recent 12 months, or even the last 24 months, the way in which COVID has disrupted supply chains globally, the way in which geopolitical events have impacted significantly on demand and supply arrangements. Nothing can be taken for granted. It could be natural disruptions. We've seen so many impacts, be it tsunamis, ash clouds, whatever it may be. And so the need for a much higher level of resilience, I think, becomes apparent. And we want to sort of contrast that with the idea of sort of a robust process, or a robust arrangement, which is where, it's strong enough to cope with the sort of general sort of ups and downs of everyday economic life. But we need something more than that, I think, in this sort of VUCA world. And this is where the idea of resilience comes in, because this is all about how do you recover when things go wrong. And it's about being able to get back up and running quickly. And that, again, suggests a need for a much higher level of flexibility than we find in traditional supply chains. I guess one of the reasons why organizations perhaps haven't been really too keen on investing in resilience is because they've, in the past at least, they've seen this as being a cost. It's going to be at the expense of efficiency, because resilience implies having something to fall back on. It could be additional inventories. It could be having capacity available when we need it, having a bit more headroom, space in which we can sort of move around. Whereas, of course, the sort of classic thinking of the last, 50 years now has really all been around this idea of lean. Lean being about efficiencies, particularly, certainly in the early days of lean thinking. It was about the reduction and elimination of waste. So you didn't want to have additional inventory. You didn't want to have surplus capacity. And so I think we've tended to see this sort of as a trade-off between efficiency and resilience. Whereas I guess what we have to do is to think outside of the box a little bit here. What I'm really looking for is ways in which we can shift that envelope, so to speak, that curve that we're looking at there. So if we can move to the right-hand side of the chart, which is saying if we can push that envelope out, we can actually add resilience, but also to maintain efficiency. Now, this may seem like a sort of impossible dream. How is it that we can get these two things working alongside each other? And that's where I think I'd like to devote a little bit of time. One way of looking at resilience is to say, well, it's a function of two things primarily. Resistance, meaning, can I put in place certain arrangements to ensure that it's a bit like getting vaccinated against COVID or flu or anything, to offer a certain level of resistance, so I'm not going to get infected in the first place. But then secondly, recognizing that bad things do happen, what are the mechanisms that I can have to hand to enable me to recover rapidly? And this goes beyond contingency planning, having plan B that we can pull off the shelf when we need it. This is about having an organization and a set of arrangements with our supply chain partners, which means that when I need flexibility, I can get it. And, I don't necessarily want to have to invest in that capability. I don't want to necessarily own, additional capacity. That would indeed be wasteful if I wasn't going to use it most of the time. I don't necessarily want to have too much inventory around the place either. But what we might want to do as part of our sort of recovery plan is to say, okay, what I'm really looking for is access to these resources, access to capacity, access to inventory, access to whatever it may be that I'm going to need. And it's that I really want to sort of structure into my supply chain architecture. And I guess, this is a sort of starting point for asking this question on how do you build this supply chain that's capable of surviving and indeed thriving in a sort of VUCA type environment. We can, I guess, sort of link this if we want to add a little bit of academic rigor to what I'm saying. As a long established sort of theory of how firms compete based upon this idea of what have been called dynamic capabilities. It's an idea that the academic David Teese first came up with, basically, and his idea of dynamic capabilities was it really reflected the firm's ability to integrate, build, and reconfigure internal and external competencies to address rapidly changing environment. And I think this is the point I'm trying to make here, that the way we compete increasingly isn't necessarily just through our products or our sort of the classic capabilities that we've so long invested in, but increasingly we're going to compete by our ability to change quickly, to pick up trends in the marketplace and respond to those rapidly, and as I say, to recover when things in my supply network don't go the way I planned. And I guess Thies recognized this in his sort of work on dynamic capabilities, because he was really identifying here that he says what matters for business is corporate agility, which he defined as the capacity, first of all, to sense and shape opportunities and threats. So that means, can I see what's happening quickly, and sort of be able then, at the point number 2, to seize that opportunity. I mean, it's one thing to recognize there's something happening out there, but secondly, can I move quickly enough to take advantage of that? And thirdly, to maintain the competitiveness as we move forward by being able to reconfigure, to change the, as I call it, the architecture of our networks, supply and demand arrangements. This notion that we're constantly going to have to be sort of changing and reshaping and moving on. It's not a world that everybody necessarily would feel terribly comfortable in, but I think it's inevitable as long as we're in this sort of VUCA world. Yeah, if things went back to the good old days of relative stability, maybe we wouldn't have to be thinking about this notion of sort of constant change. With a colleague at Said Business School in Oxford University, we came up with this idea we call structural flexibility. It's really saying that when conditions out there change quickly, and we can't predict these in advance, if conditions in the supply side or the demand side change, our ability to change with them. This is really what I guess structural flexibility is about. And obviously it implies a willingness to invest in solutions that maximize responsiveness rather than minimizing cost. Now that's a bit of a sort of a controversial challenge for many organizations to say, look, the solutions we're talking about here are probably not going to be the cheapest, but they're going to be the ones that's going to enable me to take advantage of changed conditions. Whereas if I go down that road of cost minimization, looking for the lowest cost solution, that's unlikely to give me the level of agility and responsiveness that I'm going to need. So this, I think, is the first starting point. It sort of radically challenges a lot of the investment decisions and the sort of short-term profit maximization models that have tended to dominate, I guess, for the last, I don't know how many, certainly 50 and probably more years than that. So this is I recognize here that this is not an idea that's going to necessarily be easily accepted in the boardrooms of our companies, but I think it's one that we're going to have to give a lot more attention to. Just to develop the idea a little bit further and to contrast structural flexibility with the existing ideas of flexibility, which typically we find certainly in manufacturing. We've long talked about flexible manufacturing systems, for instance, and that's really akin to what we might call dynamic flexibility. It's a reflection of the agility of the supply chain, particularly its ability to respond rapidly to variations in volume and mix. So, if demand goes up, can we ramp up production? If demand goes down, can we slow it down? If the mix changes, people want more of this color or different pack size, how quickly can we adapt? That's agility in its sort of classic sort of sense, and we still need to invest in that. And obviously, the more dynamic flexibility we can get, the better. But structural flexibility goes beyond that, because this, as we've said, is about the ability of the supply chain as a whole to adapt to fundamental change. So this is about adaptability, if you like, not just agility. So if the center of gravity, as I call it, of the supply chain changes, can the system change? By center of gravity, what I'm referring to here is the sort of interplay of forces that shape the nature of a supply chain. It could be on the demand side. We've got certain forces there. It could be demographic change in different marketplaces. It could be the growth of new markets geographically, whatever it is. It's sort of pulling us maybe in one direction. But on the other side, on the supply side, we've got other vectors, other forces which are pulling us in different directions. It could be scarcity of materials. It could be the availability of talent. It could be transport costs, whatever it may be. It sort of leads to a particular supply chain arrangement which might be more appropriate given the sort of context of today's supply demand interplay of these forces, but recognizing that those forces keep changing on the demand side, on the supply side, and so that center of gravity is going to keep shifting too. Hence the need for this much higher level of flexibility in our supply chain arrangements. I see this in a way as a sort of evolution. We keep moving on as the world moves on. We started, like 60 or so years back. We can trace the origins of supply chain management, or at least modern supply chain management, I guess, to the sort of early work, particularly of J. Forrester at MIT. That was back in the 1960s, in which we started to recognize the interplay of elements in what today we'd call a complex system. And over time, our sort of thinking has developed. The very idea of a supply chain itself, the concept, is still only like 30 or so years old in terms of thinking about how we manage across boundaries rather than just look at each organization as a separate entity. So the sort of modern way of looking at supply chains as a set of connected organizations. And that led us to think about, how we could create a more efficient set of arrangements. As I said, we talked about optimization, we talked about creating lean solutions. And that was fine when we had a world of relative stability, as I said, which might have typified, give or take a few disturbances, but the latter decades of the 20th century. As we moved into the 21st century, and we entered this VUCA world that we've been talking about, this is where I think this need for a new generation, a new model, a new paradigm for our supply chain arrangements comes in. And this is what we might think of as the adaptable supply chain, underpinned by a much higher level of structural flexibility. To give you a sort of indication of what this implies, the significant change that it needs for our thinking. Typically, in most organizations, at least in the past, and indeed still today in many, many cases, we work on the basis that we've got a certain amount of capacity. Be it in the factory, in our distribution centers, be it our sort of the people who work for us, the labor force, whatever it may be. And so if demand increases and you've got fixed capacity, basically what that means is lead times get longer. Queue forms. It's a bit like, for instance, if we're in a supermarket and all of a sudden it gets quite busy, lots more people arrive. But we still only have a couple of tills open at the checkout counter. And so the queue gets longer. And that's the way the world typically has worked in the past. Well, now we're entering into a competitive environment where customers don't want to wait longer. They demand, as we've highlighted, this sort of instantaneous requirements sometimes, same-day delivery, or even, or certainly no longer than a couple of days. So if now we're changing the model, so the model looks like on the right-hand side, what you're saying here is if you want to guarantee a certain level of service to your customers, you're going to need a much higher level of flexibility. So we want to stay with the supermarket analogy. What it means is if more people come into the shop, we're going to have to open more tills to keep those queues short. And this is a simple notion, but basically this is what really it's all about. And the challenge is, well, how do you gain that flexibility? How do you gain the capacity or the ability rather to access that capacity when you need it? And I suppose it requires us to put to one side the ideas that have governed our thinking in the past. And I've already highlighted this as a sort of an issue, a problem for all of us. It's really about saying, how can you move, for instance, if we look at the sort of, let's say the efficient supply chain is on the first column, to the more adaptable supply chain on the right hand side. With the efficient mindset, when you encounter variability, you try to control it, you try to put a lid on it. This is what Six Sigma is all about. It's very much, again, a sort of lean type approach. But what we've got to recognize is that we can't put a lid on the volatility and the uncertainty of the type we're encountering today. And so the change mindset we're talking about now is to say, well, how do you learn to live with this? And maybe how do you learn to turn it to your advantage? It's a little bit like, when we talk about risk, we always think of the downside of risk. Risk immediately makes us think about the potential danger that lies ahead. Whereas risk actually is a distribution. So it's a bit like if you go into a casino, you want to play roulette or whatever. Obviously, if you play roulette, there's a fair chance you're going to lose some money. In fact, probably a pretty big chance you're going to lose some money. But also, there is an upside. There is a chance that you could win some money, even win a lot of money, right? And so we've got to think of risk in these terms. There's an upside as well as a downside. And our ability to move quickly means that I'm more likely to take advantage of that upside when that opportunity presents itself. So first of all, that's a mindset. It's a focus that we need to sort of adapt there. Also, too, I think I briefly alluded to this before, that our sort of time horizon needs to shift here in terms of when we expect to see results. The focus that we've grown up with all these years of sort of short-term quarterly reporting in some countries, in the United States, for instance, where the stock market expects every quarter that you're going to do better than the quarter before. Whereas what we're talking about here is making investments which are not necessarily going to pay back in the immediate term. I guess you get the idea of what we're looking at here. I mean, it's really saying that a lot of things are going to have to change, and particularly the way we think about things. This is what I call the mindset. And particularly, obviously, of course, the sort of approach to decision making as well. But what can we practically do, given that you can overcome that mindset hurdle? What sort of things are available to an organization to gain this flexibility? I think one thing we might want to review is our thinking about global sourcing. For many years now, a lot of businesses have sought out low-cost sources of supply, be it materials or finished products. Have even moved manufacturing offshore to gain those benefits. What I'm talking about now is maybe not to sort of, some people talk about reshoring. I'm more concerned about saying no. I'd like to actually have a much more local for local approach. So wherever that demand is, that's where ideally I'd like my supply to be. I want shorter pipelines. I want shorter supply chains. And it might mean a much more distributed approach to manufacturing, not just having one global mega factory or regional mega factories, but actually having maybe much smaller scale, localized facilities, taking advantage of new technology, of which, as we know, an awful lot of interesting things are happening in manufacturing and distribution technology today. And maybe trying to move away from the old idea of economies of scale, which has dominated our thinking for so long, whether it be in factory design or in the sort of design of distribution systems, and instead talk about the economies of scope, which is really about being able to do more things with the same resources, implying a much higher level of adaptability, be it in product design, be it in the way in which we make the thing or the way in which we move it. And as I said before, using new technology, be it robotics, be it 3D printing, be it small footprint manufacturing, all these ideas which are starting to flow now. But also, too, adopting what I could call a real options approach to how we make decisions about the supply chain. And what this means basically is it recognizes that the best decisions are those decisions that keep the most options open. So before we make a decision about, shutting down a factory or opening up a new one or changing a supply arrangement, whatever it may be, before we do that, we should ask ourselves the question, if I make this decision, what options am I shutting down? Because ideally, if I don't know what tomorrow is going to bring, I'd like to keep some options open, as many options as possible, in fact. And the sort of options I'm talking about here is the option to expand or contract, the option to abandon, the option to switch, the option to defer the decision. Don't take it today if I can put it off till tomorrow. Now, as in the financial world, options, cost money. Yeah, you can buy and sell options. And this is what I'm really talking about here. Options to me are about making supply arrangements with other players in the supply chain, could even be competitors sometimes, about maybe sharing assets, about being able to access each other's inventory if we need to. Quite a few airlines, for instance, they may compete with each other, but they often share inventory of maintenance and spares for obvious reasons. Nobody wants to keep highly expensive inventory sitting there just in case I need it, but if we can pool it and share it. And the same goes for manufacturing capacity and distribution capacity. We see a lot of arrangements today for things like contract manufacturing, where competitors even will use the same contract manufacturer. We see shared distribution arrangements through third-party logistics companies. And we're really moving anyway, I think, down this road of what some call the sharing economy. It's a bit like the Uberization of a supply chain. You don't have to own that car. I just want to be able to access it when I need it. Now start thinking that way about your supply chain arrangements, and it takes us down a rather different sort of road. And also, too, of course, it implies a willingness to be prepared to engage in much more collaborative sort of arrangements. Not just collaborating with our upstream suppliers or our downstream distributors, but even collaborating horizontally. Could be with competitors, with other people who operate in the same sort of space, in the same sort of geography, the same sort of markets. The idea being that we're still going to compete, but if you can cooperate in such a way that enables us both to benefit, companies, for instance, who share through a third party, they might share a distribution center. I can think of several examples of competitors who use the same distribution centers run for them by third party logistics providers. So it's a sort of arm's length arrangement. And what they're saying is we don't compete in the distribution center, we compete on the shelf. So this is the idea that if we work together in certain ways, in certain places, in certain parts of the supply chain, we can all benefit, maybe. And so we can leverage other people's capabilities. We don't have to own that particular resource, but I want to be able to access it when I need it, be it knowledge, be it talent, be it distribution arrangements. Can I get it when I need it? And that's the option that I want to put in place. And as I say, maybe starting to think a little bit more about this idea of sharing things, where we can all get much better. The cost benefit would be significantly greater. And we're starting, as I say, in our personal lives, we're starting to recognize this. As more and more people start to think about, be it Airbnb, be it Uber, whatever, where we share an asset, we share a capability, we don't have to own it. I think that's the point I want to make, basically. So really bringing all of this to a conclusion. We started off by saying that the world is a very different place, and it's going to continue to change and evolve in ways that we can't predict at this stage. Who knows if we look 10 years down the road what it's going to look like. And I think we can maybe just sort of use the words of Charles Darwin as a sort of mantra here to guide us in our sort of supply chain thinking, where he said it's not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. So I hope you found what we've been saying this session of interest, and hopefully makes sense. Clearly, we've still got a long way to go before a lot of this becomes a reality. But I think that as we enter this sort of age of uncertainty and this era of turbulence, we do need new ways of looking at things, and particularly in the supply chain. So thanks very much for your attention. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.